There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. So Jesus, He called these 4 men as disciples, and it was customary for rabbis to have disciples. So this isn't odd, and this isn't cult-like. And following Jesus, it was these men's own choice. They were not made to do that, just like it's our own choice to be His disciple. And so now these men, they're going with Jesus, and they're going all around the Galilee. And Jesus, He's teaching in the synagogues, and He's preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And He's healing epileptics and paralytics and all kinds of diseases. And He's freeing people from demon possession. And this is the first time that demon possession is ever mentioned in the New Testament. And what's really funny is we don't see demon possession mentioned this way in the Old Testament. I mean, we read about Saul and about him having an evil spirit visiting him, but there was probably just as much demon possession in the Old Testament as there was at Jesus' time. And there's probably just as much as there is in our time. The only difference here is that with the presence of Jesus, the demons couldn't hide. They're exposed, because you have to realize that Satan, he doesn't really like to reveal himself. He'd rather hide himself away so that people, they don't believe he's real. But there's so many stories in the Gospels where Jesus is in a synagogue and some demon, he just starts shouting out and acting up. But you have to think, and you think, well, those people with those demons, they were probably going to that same synagogue every week and for long periods of time without any trouble, without acting up, until Jesus came and exposed them. Because demons, they couldn't be comfortable with Jesus around, because demons, they knew who He was. And so now Jesus, He's gathering quite a following. And it's not like a band's following or like a Facebook following. These people are literally following Him. They're literally walking with them. And we're told they came from places around the Galilee, but they also came from the Decapolis, which means the 10 cities. And the Decapolis, it was built by Alexander the Great. And other cities, they were coming from like Jerusalem and Judea. And it says beyond the Jordan, and that would have been the area where John was baptizing. And there were so many people following Jesus that He went up on a high mountain. And a mountain in Israel, in this area of Israel, is really just a hill. It's not like a high mountain like the Sierras or anything like that. And Jesus, He didn't go up on that mountain to separate Himself from the people, but He actually went up there to make Himself closer to each individual person. Because on that hill, the whole crowd could see Him, and they could all hear Him clearly. It would be like someone going on a stage for a concert. And tradition says that this mountain here was the Horns of Hatin, but nobody really knows which mountain it was. And then it says, when He was seated, because being seated was the proper position for a teacher to teach. And then when he sat, all the people, they would stand. And it was exactly the same way that it was in the synagogues, because that's how they respected their teachers. Now, we know that we don't respect me that much, so I have to stand because I'm trying to respect all you guys. We're just a little backwards. And so Jesus, up here at the Sermon on the Mount, He's not just teaching the disciples. He's teaching the whole group of followers. So this is a lot bigger than just the 12 disciples. And Jesus, then he begins this greatest sermon that's ever been given, the Sermon on the Mount. And people look at the Sermon on the Mount in a lot of different ways. Some people think it's God's roadmap for the world and for world peace. And then some people, they think it's kind of like a New Testament type of 10 Commandments, that these are the rules to get to heaven, and that you need to obey these rules to go to heaven. And some people, they don't even think the Sermon on the Mount applies to us at all, that it just applies to a later generation that will come in the millennial kingdom. But the whole key to the Sermon on the Mount is found in chapter 5, verse 20, where Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." That's the whole key. And so what Jesus is saying here is that this sermon is for us. So Jesus is saying that this sermon is to you. So these Beatitudes are tailored to speak to each of us individually. And it was written with you in mind. This sermon was not written for the unbelieving world. It was written to Jesus's disciples, which includes us. And he's not dealing with laws, and he's not dealing with rules. Because if it was laws and if it was rules, then the scribes and the Pharisees, they would be really good at this, because they were really good at keeping laws and they were really good at following rules. But this is not at all about laws. It's all about character. It's about your heart, and it's about having a good heart, because that's what we are. And in our hearts and how we think, that means everything. And so Jesus, he doesn't start his sermon by criticizing the wrongs of the Pharisees, but he starts giving us these Beatitudes, the attitudes that we're supposed to be, that we should be. And the word beatitude, it comes from a Latin word, which is beatus, which means divine joy or perfect happiness. But a simpler way to think of this is as the blessings. And these are the characteristics of the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And that word blessed, or well, some people say blessed, it means happy. And so what Jesus is really saying here is he's saying, oh, how happy are those? And then he follows with what would make them really, really happy. And the way that Jesus uses this word blessed, he's always using it here in the present tense, which means you can have this happiness now. This is not just for the future. And Jesus, he's often misquoted in the very first beatitude, because Jesus doesn't say here, blessed are the poor. There is no happiness in being poor or being broke. The fact is that being poor can actually bring a lot of misery, not happiness. And it's not to say that Jesus doesn't care for the poor, because he does, because there's no shame in being poor. Jesus, he loves the poor. But there is no intrinsic value in being poor. Being poor also doesn't make you closer to God. So what Jesus is saying here is, oh, how happy are those who are poor in spirit. And poor in spirit means spiritually bankrupt. And the word poor that he uses here, it does not mean the working poor. This word means the truly poor, which describes a person who has to beg for whatever he can get. So Jesus, he's not talking about those who don't have much, but he's talking about those who don't have anything, that they have nothing to commend themselves to God, which means they are humble, and that means they also have a correct estimation about themselves. So this is the opposite of pride or self-praise or self-assertion. But it's also not a false humility. It's not like one saying to themselves, oh, I'm so worthless, I can't do anything. Because pride and false humilities are don't be attitudes. And we're trying to learn the be attitudes, not the don't be attitudes. But this is being honest with ourselves. This is not to think of ourselves as too highly or too lowly, just to think of ourselves honestly. So Jesus, he's not speaking like your typical motivational speaker, like a Tony Evans, or like the kind of speech you would receive in a sales meeting where you're trying to get pumped up to go get those sales. But that's because this isn't the world's view. This is heaven's view of how to truly be successful, how to be happy. And the reality is, everybody is poor in spirit. But there's a blessing for those who recognize it and are willing to beg. And for these ones, well, they're going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And the reason that they can inherit the kingdom of heaven is because they're going to be able to fit in the kingdom of heaven, because they will look like the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. But until you recognize that you're poor in spirit, you really can't go on to the next Beatitudes. Because you really need this being poor in spirit to be able to mourn over your sin, to be humble and to be meek. And if you can't sense your need from your poverty, well, then you're never going to ever hunger or thirst for righteousness. And if you think too highly of yourself, you're going to have a hard time being merciful to others. And so our second beatitude is to mourn. And what that means is to mourn over your sin and to despise it. And to defend our sin, well, that would be our don't be attitude here. But if we mourn over our sin and we see our sin as God sees our sin, we will be comforted by God, which means we will be forgiven. But we have to confess our sin to be able to be forgiven of it. Okay, and now we're told, oh, so happy if we're meek. And meek doesn't mean weak. Moses and Jesus were both called meek. What meek means is to have a powerful personality that's controlled. Uncontrolled power is harsh. It's also unstable. Uncontrolled power is untrustworthy. And it's unreliable, just like lightning. But the meek, they can be angry, but they restrain themselves from carrying out their own wrath. They leave that place to God. And the Greek word for meek, that's the word that was used to describe a horse when it's been trained or that it was broken and able to ride. So it means great power under control. Our English word meek comes from the Anglo-Saxon word mecca, which means equal or companion. So that means it's someone who doesn't see themselves as being superior to anyone, but they are equal, so they can be a companion.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.